Hello, hello. My name is Nicole Moretti, and because I'm representing the Bill of Rights Institute, I want to welcome you to our number 7 AP US Skills discussion webinar. And tonight we're going to talk about immigration and looking at those through political cartoons. We would love to hear right off the bat where you're joining us from tonight, this afternoon, and also maybe when you are going to be taking this AP test. We'd like to know, since it's a staggered, what time you've chosen to take this exam. I am over 30-year veteran in the classroom and know that this can be very anxiety producing for you at this point. Maybe you're at that point of anxiety, maybe you're not there yet, but we want to reduce that for you. Bill of Rights Institute wants to give you some good study stuff and some stuff to help you feel confident in taking this exam, and that's what we're here for tonight. And I am joining you from the beautiful equality state of Wyoming. And our presenter tonight will be joining you from California. He's our California guy, our master wizard here, product of the Los Angeles school system and UCLA and 2016 California Teacher of the Year. And we are happy to have him joining us. And so let's get this discussion and party started tonight.
All right, thank you.
Center tonight will be joining you from.
All right, everyone. Hey, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time zone you happen to be in. Good to see some familiar names up in the chat, and it's good to see some new friends that I did not know before, but joining us today. We're taking a look at immigration in American history through political cartoons. We'll be looking at the skills of claims and evidence in sources. We'll be analyzing some political cartoons, and also just in that process, you'll be looking at some continuity and change over time. And just looking at the chat, I'm tripping out because a lot of you were taking the early exam. You're just like going for it. You're like, let's do this. Let's make this, let's just get this thing over with. So good luck to you all. May 6th, it's coming up. It's a month away. And that's pretty crazy. I think a lot of my students are going to be doing the middle of May test. We are way behind because of the distance learning, but you know, we do what we do. There's a couple things before I begin to kind of tell you about this topic, and more importantly, to work on these skills. And that is in the College Board framework, that 200-page guide that nobody reads. There's a couple of things that I think are important for you to note. And the first one is a learning objective. And so when I was looking at just kind of the history that you have to learn, one thing they expect is to explain the causes and effects of international and internal migration patterns over time. That comes up repeatedly through this course. It also connects to a thematic focus, which is push and pull factors. Push or something that makes someone want to leave their particular country or state. Pull factors makes the individual or individuals want to come to a certain areas. Shaped immigration to and migration within America, and the demographic change as a result of these moves shapes the migrant society and the environment. And I have two little animated GIFs there because immigration is a hot topic. It's a hot topic today. It was a big topic in the presidential election. It was a hot topic when I was in high school. There was a big controversy going on in California about immigration, and it really fired up a lot of people politically. And if you don't know, it has been a fact of American life since the olden days. And I want to make sure you understand the difference between these two, because sometimes it can get a little confusing. When we're talking about immigration and immigrants, which is what we're going to be doing today, we're talking about people who are not native to the United States coming to the United States. We could have easily, and just a little hint for you all, maybe you want to spend some time on this part of the review, done internal migration or migrants. And that's the movement of people from one place or region to another place or region within the same nation. And there's been so many different moments of internal migrations. There's the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North and the West during both World Wars. There's the Dust Bowl, where people were migrating out of Oklahoma and other areas. There's forced internal migrations, such as the Indian Removal Act. There's people moving to the suburbs in the 1950s. That's an internal migration. There's urbanization during the Gilded Age. So migration and immigration, they're similar, but they are different. And so today our focus is on immigration. Really quickly in the chat, one of the privileges I have is I get to teach a lot of students that come from all around the world. I like to say our school represents what America is. It's super diverse. So if you or your family are newish to the country, give a little shout out to where your peeps come from. So I'll start us off. My people, my great-grandfather came from Poland, or one of my great-grandfathers came from Poland. My last name is Polish. So represent where your ancestors were traveling from, if you will, in the chat. And I want to start with this. I found this on the internet, and I just was just fascinated by looking at it. And if you look at this particular graphic, it looks at how America's source of immigrants has changed over time. It's almost like it was meant for an AP question. And we haven't gotten to the point where people have, on the documents, you get animated or video clips. Maybe one day they will. But take a look at just kind of how these patterns change. Maybe find your state and kind of see how over many decades, the top country of birth for those immigrants happens to be changing. In some cases, it changes very quickly. And just take a moment and in the chat, what do you notice? What are the patterns, or what kind of changes do you see going on? And like I said, it does go quick, but this is the story of American immigration in just a small little window. And while you're kind of looking at it, the other thing I want to kind of remind you is this process is kind of what you've been learning about. So I did stills of these different moments. And before I go any further, in the description, my good people, there is a link to the Google Slides that I made a few last minute additions, but for the most part, all the notes, the sample questions we're going to look at, all of that could be found in the Google slide deck. So go ahead and look in the description, and hopefully it'll be a good resource for you. But if you take a look, just look at California, 1850. The majority of the immigrants were from Mexico. We're going to take a look at why that was. And then 1860, it goes China. And then in 1870, it's Ireland. And then 1880, it's China. And then boom, it goes to Germany. And we do have a 20-year gap. I didn't want to fit more than I could. And then it goes to Germany. So, just immigration and the patterns of change is something that is ever evolving. And it's not even, we think of the United States, it's a big country. But immigrants kind of settle in particular areas, especially when it comes to the Chinese immigration. It's going to be largely on the West Coast. Mexican immigration in the 1850s, there's the old saying, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And we'll take a look at what that means in just a few moments. So before we begin, I have a question for you all. This is the million-dollar question. If you're on Jeopardy, you're about to win it all. Who were the first immigrants to the Americas? To the Americas, who were the first ones to get here? You're hitting the buzzer and you're kind of saying your answer. Who would you put down? Let's see who can get it right. $1 million check will be sent to you on behalf of the Bill of Rights. Just playing, no money, just for the pride here. Who were the first immigrants to the Americas? Don't be trying to Google it either. I see you on the internet. Who the first immigrant to the Americas? A little bit of a delay here while we're waiting for some answers. Who were the first? So we got Malik with Columbus coming in. Natives were already here. The Spaniards, okay. Get some other answers. Natives were already here, but how'd they get here? Do you ever think about that? Who put them here? Aliens? Spain? A lot of people are saying Spain. Uh-oh, something happened. A lot of people are saying Spain. And this is the thing I used to, when I would go to the history parties, right? Little icebreaker. Yeah, the first immigrants were actually the indigenous people. Now, to be fair, this was 10,000 years ago, and these people came from Asia. They're crossing the Bering Strait. They're searching for a food source. They cross this Bering Strait right over in this area. And this happens, like I said, 10,000 years ago. And over many, many years, they eventually become what we call the indigenous people of the Americas, or Native Americans, American Indians. Everyone kind of has their own different word, but they're technically immigrants. There were not nation states like we think about today, but they are coming from one land way over here in Asia, looking for that food source, and then adapting to these different environments. And that kind of rises up into these different societies. So if you really want to be technical, the indigenous people are our first immigrants. They were not just here the moment the earth appeared or whatever happened. I'm not a scientist. Then you all know how the story went, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a review of what you may already know, and then we're going to practice with the cartoons and using the cartoons for evidence. So yeah, for those of you that said the Spaniards, you're correct, right? The arrival of Columbus starts off this process. And in some of our other sessions, we've been looking at just kind of this process unfold. It starts in 1492. And I'm going to just focus on the United States, or what will be the United States. And you could see by 1700, who's claiming land? You got France, you got England, you had the Dutch for a cool minute. And then, of course, you had the Spanish. And so all these different European countries, of course, are coming to what will be the US. And the way you want to think about immigration is there are different waves. And the first wave is this kind of period early on in our history before we're really a country, 1607, with the first colonists going to Jamestown to the 1820s. And these dates are not perfect. Don't get it twisted. Don't say, okay, so Mr. Jocz said 1607. Nah, but when we talk about the 13 colonies, that's the first kind of immigrants. And remember what happens. You have these different regions: New England, the middle, the Chesapeake, the lower South, and you had different people coming. So for instance, in the Chesapeake, it's mainly English settlers trying to make that money. In the New England, they're mainly English settlers, but they predominantly were Pilgrims or Puritans. Then you had diversity more in the middle colonies. In the middle colonies, especially New York, you had Dutch, but they also had a wide variety of folks coming from not just the Dutch Empire. In Pennsylvania, you have Quakers. And then of course, one thing that oftentimes gets kind of overlooked or looked at poorly is the forced migration. Not all immigration is voluntary, and people of African descent were forcibly brought not to the United States, but also to all of the continent. We've looked at that a few times over the course of our sessions. And remember, one point I've been trying to make is there has been an ethnic diversity of this country before we were a country. So you could take a look and you could see on this kind of map, this yellowish color is predominantly African people who were brought without choice very often. Over up in this particular area, you have the English settlers. You have a Dutch presence in this particular part of the colonies, which is what will become New York. And then you have German and Scots-Irish and Scottish immigrants coming in and largely going into the backcountry. So when we think about the first kind of wave of immigrants, they're largely homogenous. They're mainly, the overwhelming majority are Anglo-Saxon people, mainly people from England. Most of them, not all of them, are Protestant, but there are Quakers, there's Catholics coming, but overwhelmingly they're Protestant. And to put it even more simply, they're white people. They're white Protestants. And what happens in this first wave, this colonial period, is there's relatively quick assimilation of other groups. There's a whole bunch of land. There's a huge, pretty much limitless degree of opportunity, and there's a demand for labor. So this particular period is this kind of mass immigration, which starts with the colonial period, but goes into our early history under the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, Jefferson, the early 1800s. That's kind of the first wave. So mainly British, Protestant, white immigrants. But think back to this map, it wasn't completely. We've always had diversity, whether it be Catholics in Maryland, African individuals brought into any of the 13 colonies, Quakers in Pennsylvania. It's a very diverse experience. What happens though, and there are exceptions, and the exceptions basically are there is going to be challenges when it came to immigration, but they're not as pronounced as they're going to be in the second and especially the third wave of immigrants. And so what you're going to see, sorry about that, 1800s is the date in the court. There's no start date, stop date that's official. But you are going to see prejudice, of course, towards African Americans. You're going to see religious prejudice against Catholics. There is going to be some anti-German feelings early on, but it's not as pronounced, like I said, as you're going to see a little bit later. So we've always been a nation of immigrants, and this has always kind of created unique challenges and opportunities. This is the period that most students think about when you think about immigration, because you almost instinctually remember this second wave is, once again, no start date. But if you look at this graphic right here, 1820 to about the Civil War. And what we're talking about there is we're talking about a shift of who's coming. Now, here's the thing that gets a little confusing. Overwhelmingly, the immigrants that are coming in during this period are largely coming from the same region. So we're talking Northern and Western Europe, but they're starting to kind of come in greater numbers from Ireland, especially in the 1840s. And like I said, all these slides are in the description. So I am going to go quick so we have time for the skills. And then you have, there's the same reasons immigrants always come. There's something probably not going so well in their country, potato famine or economic just lack of opportunity. Many of these immigrants who come, not all, are poor. They're largely Catholic, and they settle in cities, especially cities like Boston, New York, places like this. Then the second biggest group is the Germans. They're also fleeing things that immigrants flee, economic uncertainty, there's political instability in Germany. And in the case of the Germans, they are going to cities, but they're also settling in the Midwest. And there's a wide variety of German immigrants who come. Some are Protestant, some are Catholic. There are Jewish Germans, Levi Strauss, for example, shout out to the Gene guy. And they're going to form their tight-knit communities. So in this period, this is the period you kind of see a shift. It's not the majority are coming from England, but you have the Irish and the Germans. Now, in the chat, tell me, what's going to be some concerns that will be unique to the Irish or the Germans if you are a, someone who's been here for quite a long time and you're used to white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, English-speaking American? I gave you some hints there. What will the Irish in particular pose as a threat, according to some people? And what will the Germans pose as a threat, according to some people? Anyone want to take a wild guess? Because what you're going to see, and this is in the key concepts, mainly from Ireland and Germany, often settling in ethnic communities, what's going to be the danger that's going to occur with those immigrants? Why would people be like, time out, let's chill on this? Okay. Yes, for the Irish, it's going to be the fact that many of them are Catholic. There is going to be some economic tension, as Malik's mentioning, with jobs in northern factories. And then when it comes to the Germans, what language they speak in? German. It's going to be this threat to America's kind of cultural norm, as some folks saw it. Now, here's the part where we got to go time out again. Because one thing that gets oftentimes oversimplified is, these aren't the only groups. Remember that thing I showed you with California? In 1848, following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, suddenly people who are living in California or Arizona who are Spanish, Mexican descent, they are under the treaty eligible to become American citizens because, as I mentioned, they didn't cross the border crossed them. They are now part of the United States social fabric. Likewise, there is going to be this huge increase of Chinese immigrants and, to a smaller extent, immigrants from other parts of Asia, but the Chinese especially. This photo really kind of shows you the diversity of the mines and the gold fields, not just in California, but in places like Colorado, Nevada, there's going to be this huge Chinese immigration, and then also with the railroad. This is going to create a whole unique set of other challenges, according to some folks. So I'm looking at the clock, so I'm going to kind of speed up my quick overview so we make sure we get to the skills part. And so if you look at 1850, 2 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the #1 country of origin for the immigrants of California or Mexico. Then you get the Chinese. Then there's a brief moment where the Irish kind of take over, the Chinese again. But remember, in 1883, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed. And so the #1 immigrants are German, and it goes on if you want to go back to that graphic. So immigration presents challenges. And not all people feel that these challenges are real, but they're real in terms of the political debate. So for some, there was a perception that these individuals are taking jobs from native-born Americans. There's concerns that they would outvote the Native Americans, native being American-born, not Native American people, that they're going to ruin Anglo-Saxon culture, that Roman Catholics are going to be unduly kind of influenced by the Pope and the Vatican. And there starts to be the emergence of groups like the Know Nothing Party, which advocated for restrictions on immigration. And they're not some like small little party that doesn't, we kind of laugh at them because they have a silly name, but they're legit. They get a bunch of the popular vote in a presidential election in 1856. They actually had offices and held political office in many different states. So the Know Nothing Party had some influence on American politics. What happens, though, remember, is some immigrants during this period, it goes beyond just the proposed exclusion or racist attacks or nativist attacks. There's going to be actual exclusion for some groups. And in particular is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1883. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is unique for a number of reasons, but one, it's specifically targeting a particular group. It's saying that this group is undesirable because of their country of origin, because of the characteristics that are assumed to apply to those immigrants. And the Chinese Exclusion Act will be a part of American law all the way up until the 1940s, until 1943, I think, when China becomes part of the US allies and it gets undone partially. So nativism increases during this period because there's this fear of the Irish, the Germans, but in particular, some groups have it a lot worse because the Chinese were seen as so foreign that they could never really be part of this American kind of society. The third wave is probably one you also kind of know some stuff about. In the third wave, can anybody tell me what shift happens in the late 19th century to 1924? Like what happens? Who are the immigrants coming in? Especially when we look at 1890s, who are the big groups coming in? The number, top 3 groups. If the first group was mainly the British, and then the second group was the Irish and the Germans, all of which are Northern and Western European countries, the third group's going to see the rise of a new part of Europe. Anyone remember from kind of when we start talking about this third wave of immigrants? It is this period where in the 1890s, you could see the Northern Western European countries are Great Britain. You have the Irish, you have those, but you're going to start to see this kind of rise of the Southern, the Eastern European immigrants. And so we're going to be talking about just kind of this idea of these immigrants kind of coming in. Now, if you ask a random person on the street, well, these different European countries, well, they may all look to be kind of, white. But there was a perception that these were the lowest of the low in terms of who could come from Europe. And so these were generalizations that were made about these Southern Eastern European immigrants, that these immigrants were coming in these huge numbers from countries like Italy, Russia, Poland. Not only do they not speak English, but very often it is the norm that they're different religions other than Protestant. Maybe it was Catholicism, Jewish. They were very, very illiterate and unskilled. On the whole was the perception. They're reluctant to assimilate. And there's a belief that they're bringing in these radical ideas into the country. And so guess what happens is you start seeing another rise of dramatic nativism. And many of the same arguments are made, but they're made even more so because they're seen as racially inferior. They're not WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. There's a feeling amongst even labor unions that, you know, just like the Irish, they're taking jobs, they lowered wages. There's political backlash like we saw as well. But this time it's, oh, they're bringing in radical ideas, anarchism, socialism. There's a religious element, there's a racial element. And keep in mind, there were different motives for this anti-immigrant feeling in the country. And ultimately, what happens is you get exclusions being passed. You know, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed with one particular group in mind. The Gentleman's Agreement was done with Theodore Roosevelt and the government of Japan to restrict Japanese immigrants. The literacy test was passed to try to keep out undesirable immigrants, especially those Southern Eastern European immigrants. Remember, after World War I, and even during the war, you have the Red Scare. After the war, the Palmer raids, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. And then you get the National Origins Act, which sets the quota up at 2%. And the whole purpose of this was to keep out those immigrants who were seen as undesirable. And so the KKK also brands itself as a very patriotic organization during the 20s. We're the one preserving the American way of life. And so these battles happen. Now, let's take a look at this in real life, y'all. Take a look at this question. This is a question that I've seen different versions of it. And so it doesn't really matter the wording, but could you tackle it? Could you do something with it? And I haven't even touched 1965 to 2000. And here's the deal. Compare and contrast the patterns of immigration and the American response to those immigrants in two of the following periods. So let's just ignore 1965 to 2000 because chances are you haven't even covered it in class. And if you have, bravo. But if you were just going to compare and contrast what's similar and what's different between 1820 to 1860 and 1880 to 1924, what could you possibly bring as evidence to show what is similar and what is different? And to Vicky's point, I think the one thing to keep in mind is those distinctions of legal and vetted those are more of a modern take on the immigration process. When it comes to the Quota Acts, those immigrants were coming in legally through Ellis Island, Angel Island on the West Coast. And so, but there was very much this kind of public outcry as well. So if you were taking a look at this question, here's the thing. If you were here last week, I told you the dates kind of matter. Not that you have to memorize dates, but if you get a question like that, then you're going to kind of need to know what are the markers here. So 1820 is kind of like the beginning of the second immigration wave, this kind of the beginning of the Irish and German becoming more of the norm of who was the majority coming in. The British were kind of third. 1860s, the Civil War, which kind of puts pause on immigration in terms of the numbers being what they were. 1880, which is the second part of the question, is the shifting immigration pattern. This is the Southern Eastern European immigrants coming in. These kind of the new immigrants as they begin to be called. And then 1924 is the Quota Act of 1924. And then I'm going to get to this in just a moment, just to kind of preview it. 1965 is the big change that happens with the Immigration and Nationality Act. So if you were to compare and contrast, and it's hard to do in a chat because you're probably trying to like pay attention and then chat. But we see Malik saying many Irish arrived due to the potato famine. Before that, the numbers weren't as high. But keep in mind with this particular question, when you're comparing and contrasting, you got to say, okay, what was similar in this period to this period, or what was different? So first wave, there was nativism with the Road Know Nothing Party, Maddie's saying, and the second wave is Quota Acts. Okay, there you go. With the response, right? Both, there was a response, right? There was an increase in nativism. In one case, it's a political party who wants to restrict immigrants. In the second case, it's actual federal law where the government's saying we're going to put a quota because we feel that certain immigrants should be excluded. Laws both restricted immigrants in both periods of times. The difference could be a great example, Samantha, in terms of the difference. You know, the who was coming is different in these two time periods. There's a lot of different things you could do with this question if you know what those patterns of immigration in America's responses were. And notice something about this question, it has two parts to it. What are the patterns? So you got to be able to say, okay, it was mainly immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, Irish, German, English. This is mainly immigrants from Southern Eastern Europe, Russian, Italian, Greeks, as some examples. And then responses in both periods, there was nativism. You need to be able to kind of generate some ideas, and that's important. And so the beautiful thing about, you know, the exam is it doesn't require you to know everything you've learned, but to show examples of how what you learn applies to a particular prompt. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to get to the political cartoons, but you're going to learn about 1965. And if you don't learn about it in class because of time, you'll get to it when you read on your own, hopefully. This is going to be a game changer in terms of immigration in America. And what happens is Lyndon Johnson, you can see him right there signing the bill into law, is going to sign what is known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And it basically eliminated the quota system, the racial quota systems that had been a part of US policy since the 1920s. And what many historians and people who study this say is this really kind of begins our fourth wave of immigration. And don't worry if you don't know, like, oh, I didn't know it was called the fourth. Like, those are just numbers that historians create. Like, they're not going to ask you which is the fourth wave. But when we think of post 1965, we're talking about, notice what happens. And this is kind of hard to see on your end, I'm sure. But after 1965, you could see on this particular graphic, the source of who's coming dramatically changes. And many of those immigrants who are coming in now are not from European countries. They are from places largely in Latin America, Asia, and even the Middle East. So for instance, since 1965 to 2015, the top countries, Mexico, China, India, and the Philippines. Whereas if you look at that third wave, which was 1890 to the 1920s, it's Italy, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Poland. You still have immigrants coming from Germany and Ireland, but they're way less than they once were. And then if you look at that kind of first wave in the 1820s to German, Irish, so on. So what happens with the immigration quota removal is America becomes much more diverse because you have people who are not European, AKA not white, coming into the United States. And this creates new debates and new conversations. And you may remember discussions about, certain countries being banned, walls being built, programs like DACA. These are very often the outcome of these changing demographics and the response politically. We're not going to spend too much time on that because I want to get you some practice. So let's take a look at two questions, and we're going to only focus on one, but I want to show you they word it in different ways. So here's one way they may kind of ask you something. Describe an account for the rise of nativism in America, in American society from 1820 to 1883. And once again, knowing, Chinese Exclusion Act, 1880s, that helps you marker that date. 1820, there was the market revolution going on, and I know a lot of Irish immigrants were coming in because they were working in the factories. So kind of grounding yourself about what you need to write about for a particular prompt. Here's a different kind of prompt. This one's asking you about the nativism. This one's asking you evaluate the extent to which immigration affected US culture in the period from 1820 to 1883. So instead of kind of looking at the nativism, how did it affect US culture? I think this type of question is hard. It's like, what do you mean by that? And so how did it affect American culture? So let's practice this. So the other thing we're practicing today is a skill. What is the source's point of view, purpose? What's the historical situation? Who's the audience? And if you're thinking about a DBQ, that would be the hippo analysis or the happy analysis. Or if you're doing multiple choice, they may ask you, which of the following would agree with this political or this source? It requires you to do that. So let's take a look at this first one and think about, if this is the question, how might this cartoon help you answer that question? So I'll give you a moment to take a look at it. So this is the evaluate the extent to which immigration affected US culture in the period from 1820 to 1883. What from this cartoon, and I should have given you a year, and I think for some reason I did not write that down. So let's just assume this is 1850s. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone in the comments will tell me. So if this is your document, and this is the prompt, and you had to use this document, this cartoon, to answer that prompt, what kinds of things would you possibly share out or type or write? So forget coming up with the thesis statement. What is this document? How does this allow us to answer this question? Notice the question, though, is about the culture in the period 1820 to 1883. And while you're kind of thinking about it, okay, so Samantha says, looks like the Irish person is running away with the ballot box, taking over politics. That's a good example. Yeah, there's this, you know, there was a fear amongst nativists. So if this question was the nativism question, you could talk about how there was a fear amongst nativists that they were going to dominate politics and steal American elections with their huge number of votes. If this is the culture one, you could say the Irish, and to a smaller extent, the Germans, had enormous political power in America because when they go to certain cities like Boston, they're able to vote. And very often they would vote at this time for the Democratic Party. Cole's mentioning the anti-German nativism in the temperance movement. Yes, excellent. There was a concern that these immigrants, remember in this time period, 1820 to 1883, there was a growing temperance movement where they were trying to get people to moderate or eliminate their drinking, right? And so that kind of was spawned by this change of immigrants. And there was a feeling that this stereotype of the Irish of drinking their whiskey and the Germans drinking their beer was a danger to the morals of this country. So yeah, some people say that temperance was targeting these immigrant communities. Okay, so other people are talking about the effects. Now, when you say something like the effects they could have on society, keep in mind that's saying a lot without saying, that's saying nothing but saying a lot. Like, what do you mean by that? So give an example. So for example, this could be a fear of political change or of their influence in the American political process. Or just the fact that there was, yeah, this is clearly from the perspective. And for each of these cartoons, think about like, what's the point of view or the purpose or the audience for it? This is very much not looking at the Irish or the Germans as a positive thing in American life. Take a look at another one. This one's really hard to see, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But this one, I just was looking at different cartoons, and this one just kind of made me just kind of laugh, right? That this was the big fear. You know, here we are. I don't think many people are fearing a Catholic invasion. But this is actually a political cartoon from 1855. And I know you can't read all the little sources here, and you don't really need to. This was from the perspective of the Know Nothing Party and anti-immigrant sympathizers. And they viewed these Catholic immigrants coming in as foreign invaders that are trying to take over the country. I mean, literally, this Pope-like figure is stepping off of his boat onto US soil to invade the United States. So you could talk about how the rise or the changing demographics of religious groups caused fear amongst some people. Take a look at this one. Same question. I'll tell you when the question changes. How might this source, or what comes to mind when you look at this particular source at this period? Poor House from Galway. Some of these you got to have the historical reference, or you're like, what's Galway? And just to let you know, because unless you've traveled or yourself are from that, that is a city in West Ireland. Okay, so this is a city in Ireland. What is the view here? What is the view here in terms of what these immigrants coming in are going to mean for American culture in this time period? And in this particular one, you have this kind of fear that actually the British, to some extent, but the British are dumping their undesirable, the poor, the undesirable people into the United States. And so this idea that we are getting not the best and the brightest, but we are getting the kind of leftovers or the outcast or the downtrodden, that was very often the view of many towards the Irish. Yeah, kind of putting this weight on society. And so this can kind of very much go with that economic argument. Oh, these Irish immigrants are going to take jobs in lower wages. This can very much go to the political argument, but you see this kind of view as these immigrants being a burden on American society, a burden on American culture because of their religious views and because of their poverty. This one people always mess up. So let me show you this one and tell me what you think this one means. Perhaps the most horrific cartoon and also the most fascinating cartoon all in one. The great fear of the period. Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. Anyone know what these two figures are meant to represent? Usually people get this particular one pretty easily, but then sometimes they have trouble here. What do you think is the point of view or the message of this particular cartoon? This is meant to be an Irish immigrant. Oftentimes the Irish were portrayed as like ape-like figures, kind of, dehumanized. Oftentimes the Chinese were also dehumanized, and they're both eating Uncle Sam. Remember, the Irish played an important role on the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, as did many Chinese immigrants. They're both devouring Uncle Sam, which can very much represent, the destruction of American culture, their refusal to assimilate. At least that's the belief. And notice what happens, though, as they eat Uncle Sam, eventually the Chinese immigrant eats the Irish and then takes his hat for good measure. And so this idea of the greatest threat was, in fact, that of the Chinese. And yes, the Irish are also a threat. But what you see here is this idea that these immigrants are so foreign, so unwilling to kind of join the American melting pot. Yeah, and that the Chinese, because think about it, at least the Irish at the end of the day, they spoke English and they're white. The Chinese had their own unique language, their own unique religion. They were considered so foreign, so different. And back to Emily's point, yeah, there was this fear that they would take over the country, but there was this fear that one was a greater threat than the other, in this case, the Chinese. And so when it comes to nativism, not all nativism is treated equal. The Irish had it very rough, but the Chinese were specifically excluded by the US government. That did not happen to the Irish. Employers would have signs, no Irish need apply. The Irish were the victims of violence at times, but it wasn't legislated into our laws of our country. Let me show you a different one, because this one is another one that I think is unique for a couple of reasons. Same question here. What's the point of view of this cartoon? And if you all get this, y'all might as well just take the AP exam right now, because this gets so often misinterpreted. So imagine this is a document. You have to take a look at it. What is it saying when it comes to the issue of immigration? Point of view. And here's the title: The Only One Barred Out, Enlightened American Statesman. We must draw the line somewhere, you know. So the only one barred out are the Chinese. And then the American statesman kind of says, we must draw the line somewhere, you know. So this argument, we can't just let everybody in or anybody in. You'll notice the door is closed, golden gate of liberty, slammed shut. Ironically, letting everyone else in besides Chinese. But why is that ironic, Cole? Like, why would that be an ironic thing according to this cartoon? Because this cartoon is actually not supportive of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, the Chinese are not excluded, but notice, communists, nihilists, socialists, Finland, and hoodlums welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen, which is an offensive term, so don't go around saying it. Yeah, so this idea that you're going to let all these people that are of morally questionable character, but instead of kind of dealing with the socialists, the hoodlums, or the people that you feel are wrong, at least the Chinese are bringing some, like, a willingness to work hard. So this one is actually critiquing the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I think is interesting because you don't see too much critiques of it. I mean, it becomes law and stays law for many, many decades. But this one is actually kind of pointing out, why not deal with the suspected radical beliefs or the morally questionable character of individuals rather than excluding an entire race of people, which was the tactic. Fun fact, I was curious, where did this cartoon get published? You know, you see these cartoons in your classes or in the teacher's PowerPoints, but this is how it appeared in a newspaper at the time. And right in between all the different ads and articles was this ad basically calling out the Chinese Exclusion Act. Let me show you a few more here. Let's go back to this one that we kind of quickly looked at. This is a question you should be able to kind of say some stuff about, because it could show up as a multiple choice question. Which of the following is similar? What's different? And then give you some choices. So let's take a look at a few more cartoons here. Let's stick with this one here. What's the argument or point of view in this cartoon, and how would it help you answer the question? And I'm running really low on time, so I'm going to kind of talk through a few of these just so you can kind of see. So if you were comparing and contrasting, you know, this cartoon says, what shall we do with our boys? And you have all these, you know, they look to have nothing to do, so perhaps they're unemployed. And you have this very kind of oddly driven, very dehumanized looking Chinese immigrant with a huge number of arms. I think someone in one of our previous sessions, not actually drawn as an octopus, but as a human being with octopus-like extra arms. And he's just doing all these different jobs, whether it be sewing or whatever the heck all these jobs are. And this idea is, this is a very nativist argument against the Chinese. You're coming in here and you're taking all these jobs. Meanwhile, good native-born American men are not able to work. And so therefore we must exclude these immigrants who are becoming problematic. Let me show you just kind of how you're going to need to do this on a bigger scale. So I don't remember right off the top of my head what date this one was, but this one was 1919 during the Red Scare Pomerates. This one was during, I think, the 1860s or 70s. I'm not 100% sure. So if you're watching this after the fact, beautiful. But these have a very similar, if you were to compare and contrast immigration and responses, notice in both of these cartoons, let's just say this is document 1 and this is document 2. This is from 1820 to 1860 period of immigration. This is meant to be an Irish, if we go over here, this is meant to be an Irish immigrant, oftentimes portrayed very ape-like, as savage, dehumanized. And then all the other immigrants are in there happy, the Irish is not. If you look at this, this is meant to represent this time period in American immigration history. This is meant to be 1818 to 1924. Both of them are concerned about this idea that these immigrants will not assimilate into this American melting pot. They will not adopt American culture. they will kind of change America fundamentally because of their religion, their language, their behavior, their culture, whatever it is. But notice a distinction here. In this one, it's not necessarily a racial group. It is more about radical ideas, the red flag, Bolshevism, the mad notions of Europe, un-American ideals, anarchy. And Uncle Sam's trying to scoop out the scum that has risen to the surface as it does when you make soup. In this one, it's the Irish as a people, as a culture. And what's interesting is in both cases, there's concerns that immigrants are going to fundamentally change American society for the worse. But this one is much more concerned about these radical beliefs, which oftentimes were associated with the Southern Eastern European immigrants, but both show a similar and different view about American immigration. So one of the things you're going to need to be able to do on the DBQ is notice patterns in the evidence. So maybe both of these, you want to use this in terms of the American response was concern about American culture being threatened by foreigners. In document 1, it is concerned about the Irish, perhaps their Catholic faith and their tendency to drink, which was the stereotype or whatever. In document 2, it's the radical beliefs that many of the immigrants from Southern Eastern European brought to the United States, or the perception that they brought. And then you can kind of then also show a difference. Whereas in one, it was mainly based upon a group of people. This one was based upon a particular ideological reasoning. So this process of just looking at a cartoon and seeing what could you do with it and how it helps you answer a question is something that you need to kind of internalize so that you don't repeat the patterns that a lot of students do, which is, oh, in document 1, you have a cartoon. There's a lot of people trying to come in. They're from Europe. And then Uncle Sam is here and he puts a thing. It's a gate. It says 3, and then less people come in. Like, that's not what you're intending to do on the AP exam. Rather, as we see, this document represents calls amongst nativists to restrict undesirable immigrants from Europe. The document is referencing the Quota Acts of the 1920s, which were intended to favor immigrants from Northern and Western European countries, which were considered much more desirable. You need to be able to kind of advance an argument. Let me show you a couple other things here. You know, there's been different moments where war has accelerated or increased nativism. So during World War I, there was a lot of anti-German feelings. There was a sense that Germans were only fake Americans. They would publicly wave the American flag, but inside their hearts and inside their homes, they would toast the Kaiser and secretly root for the Germans to win World War I. There was anti-German sentiment that increased. There were some Germans who were attacked. Hamburgers were renamed Liberty sandwiches. There was a fear right after World War I that these radical immigrants were going to come in and cause concerns, and they were going to try to spread their radical ideology, in this case, literally taking the white from the flag and turning it red. During World War II, there was ironically, this labor shortage. If you recall, during the Great Depression, Mexican immigrants and even some Mexican Americans, people who were American citizens, were deported during something called repatriation. And then during World War II, the government establishes the Bracero program to bring in Mexican laborers to help out with the labor shortages, in particular agriculture. And let's kind of sit on this one for a moment. Can someone tell me, what does this show us about immigration and nativism and fear during this period? And this is a cartoon from 1942. And you are correct if you are noticing that it is a Dr. Seuss cartoon. And notice what it says right here, waiting for the signal from home. You have all these characters that look oddly similar with their kind of very sinister grin and teeth. and they're kind of being handed TNT explosives. And the implication was that if there is some sort of sign from Japan, which is considered home, then these people were just waiting all along the West Coast to act to try to deal with the United States. This belief, as Kenyon is pointing out, that the Japanese are loyal to Japan and dangerous. And the reality is, we all hopefully have learned the history that the Japanese Americans, many of the people put in internment camps were Japanese Americans with loyalty to the US, but yet were treated with suspicion, even though they weren't even themselves immigrants. Many of them were second generation. But there was this belief that they were just kind of waiting to sabotage the US from within. Interestingly enough, just because it was in the news recently, you know, Dr. Seuss is an interesting guy because a lot of his books and his cartoons were very much built around social messages. And I'm a big believer in redemption. And one of the things that happens is Dr. Seuss, who went to Japan in the 1950s, he actually had this epiphany about his portrayal of Japanese and Japanese Americans. And he actually wrote a book. You maybe saw the movie or read the book, Horton Hears a Who, which basically is about an elephant who has to protect this speck of dust, which is populated by a bunch of little people. And you know, one of the things that is a part of that book or that story is a person no matter how small. And the book, I didn't know this until preparing for this presentation, was actually dedicated to one of the individuals he met in Japan who kind of opened his eyes up to some of his own racial bigotry. And so this cartoon was done a bit after. And what this country needs is a good mental insecticide. And what you have Uncle Sam doing is spraying some stuff into some people's heads. And was that in my head? And what shoots out is a racial prejudice bug. And so this kind of symbolizes Dr. Seuss's own transformation. He still had some problematic portrayals of different groups of people in his books, but he made attempts to atone for some of these things in his later work. But as you could see in cartoons like this, or cartoons like this, or this, during war, there's been these feelings that sometimes immigrants or people just perceived to be immigrants may in fact be a threat. And oftentimes that has led to violations of people's liberties and freedoms. We're not gonna have time to go into this one, but I gave you an SAQ in the document. This cartoon made me kind of think a little bit. I had never seen it before, but this one deals with the rise of nativism in the 1920s. And in particular, the role of the KKK of being one of the organizations that promoted a lot of the nativist thinking. Not the only organization, but promoted it. And this particular cartoon was done by an individual who was a preacher, but who also promoted the KKK through his art. And you could see the fear of what they felt was unrestricted immigration, communism, alcohol, and Catholicism, Rome, rum, red, and Uncle Sam doing nothing to address these concerns. So this might be like an SAQ type question if you get a political cartoon. What's the perspective? What development led to this perspective? And what is the effect of this perspective? And so that would be a good thing to kind of think about as well. Any questions before we head out today? Let me know in the chat. I see one about the fifth column. Good question, Lucy. A fifth column is a group of people who try to undermine a country from within. I don't exactly know. I'm sure there's a really good reason for why it's called fifth column. But basically, they try to it's a group within a country or an organization that try to help out the enemy from within the particular country. So in this case, Dr. Seuss is accusing the people of Japanese ancestry of being the enemy from within, when we do know, in fact, there was no evidence of that actually being a widespread plot. All right, y'all. So I would take some time to kind of go through some of the cartoons that we didn't get to today, because you never know, you might just hit the jackpot and they may actually appear on the exam. So wouldn't it be cool if you already looked at them? Immigration is a hot topic in American society today. So even if it's not on some AP exam, it's still important that you know the history of American immigration so that you can make those informed decisions as those brilliant folks that you all are. Hope to see you next week. We have 2 more, but that's it for me today.
Okay, well, we are so glad that you've joined us. And our next one is going to be, I believe, reconstruction, argumentation, and thesis writing. In the chat, I dropped in a couple of links from BRI's website where you can go and look at political cartoons, a whole bunch of them there that you can go and study and look at. And also some links on immigration that would be easy to go through and look and do some of this reviewing for. So hopefully you'll take a look at those as you're thinking about studying for this exam, and come back and join us again tomorrow for our next discussion. We'll see you all then. Thank you for joining us.